I was going through my late grandmother's belongings in her attic on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in August when I found a metal lockbox hidden behind decades of Christmas decorations and old photo albums and boxes of my grandfather's clothes that no one had been able to bring themselves to donate in the 15 years since he'd passed. The attic was stifling, the kind of heat that makes you dizzy and nauseous, and I'd been up there for 3 hours already sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions, trying to figure out what to keep and what to give away and what to throw out. My grandmother had been a keeper of everything, unable to part with anything that might have sentimental value or might be useful someday, and the result was an attic packed floor to ceiling with boxes and bags and trunks full of stuff that told the story of our family going back generations. The lockbox was heavy, maybe 10 or 15 pounds, made of gray metal that had been painted at some point but now showed rust and scratches from years of storage. It was secured with a combination lock that had rusted slightly from years in the humid attic air, the kind of lock with 4 number wheels that you have to line up correctly to open. There was no key, no note explaining what was inside, nothing to indicate why this box had been hidden so deliberately behind so many other boxes in the far corner of the attic, where you'd only find it if you were determined to clear out every single item. I almost left it there, almost moved on to the next stack of boxes because I was tired and hot and emotionally drained from going through my grandmother's things and finding reminders of her everywhere. But something made me pause. Some instinct or curiosity or just stubborn completeness made me pick up the heavy box and bring it downstairs to the cooler kitchen, where I spent 20 minutes trying different number combinations based on family birthdays, anniversaries, and addresses. I tried my grandmother's birthday, my grandfather's birthday, my mom's birthday, my own birthday. I tried the year my grandparents got married, the year they bought this house, the year my mom was born. I tried the last 4 digits of their old phone number and their anniversary date and every significant number I could think of that might mean something to my grandmother. Finally, on what I decided would be my last attempt before giving up and maybe taking the box to a locksmith, I tried the date of my grandfather's death. The numbers lined up, the lock clicked, and the box opened. Inside the lockbox, among various documents and old jewelry, I found a contract, a legal contract, typed on official-looking letterhead from a law firm called Morrison, Bennett & Associates, with an address in downtown Philadelphia. The paper was that heavy, cream-colored stock that legal documents are printed on, the kind that feels expensive and official in your hands. The contract was dated April 15, 1993, which I calculated quickly in my head was exactly 3 months before I was born in July of that year. And there, on the signature line at the bottom of the 4th and final page, was my full legal name written in flowing cursive handwriting. Not my nickname, Emma, which is what everyone calls me, not E. Ross or Emma Ross, my complete formal name, Emma Catherine Ross, with the Catherine spelled out in full with its weird old-fashioned spelling that my mom had insisted on using, even though I'd always wanted it to be Catherine with a C like normal people. But I'd never signed this contract. I'd never even seen it before in my life. I would have remembered signing something this formal and official looking. The signature wasn't mine. The handwriting was flowing and confident and had loops and flourishes that my own cramped utilitarian handwriting had never possessed. Someone had signed my name, my full, complete legal name with the middle name I rarely used, on a legal document dated before I existed. And the name printed next to the other signature line, the person who'd apparently entered into this agreement with me before I was even born, was someone I'd never heard of in my entire life. A man named Richard Andrew Thorne, with an address listed as 1247 Walnut Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten countless meals during my childhood, where I'd done homework and played board games and had serious conversations with my grandparents about life and growing up. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, dust motes dancing in the light, and I felt like I'd stepped into an alternate reality where nothing made sense anymore. I read through the contract 3 times, struggling with the dense legal language that seemed designed to be as confusing and impenetrable as possible. It was full of whereas clauses and party of the first part terminology and legal jargon that I'd need a dictionary and possibly a law degree to fully understand. But even with my limited legal knowledge, even through the obfuscating language, I could understand the basic terms. It was an agreement for services to be rendered, compensation to be provided, obligations to be met upon reaching majority age. The contract stated that Emma Catherine Ross, party of the second part, agrees upon reaching the age of 30 years to provide consulting services to Richard Andrew Thummern, party of the first part, or to his designated heirs and assigns in matters of business investment for a period of not less than 5 years, not to exceed 10 hours per week, at a rate of compensation to be determined based on prevailing market rates for similar professional consulting services. There were clauses about the specific nature of the consulting services, which included but were not limited to analysis of investment opportunities, research into potential business ventures, preparation of reports and recommendations, and attending meetings as requested. There were clauses about what would happen if I failed to provide these services, including financial penalties and legal remedies available to Richard Thorne or his estate. There was an alternative option where instead of providing 5 years of consulting services, I could make a lump sum payment of $50,000 adjusted for inflation from the date of the agreement. The contract specified that this payment would satisfy all obligations and release me from any further duties under the agreement. At the bottom of the final page, 2 signatures. One was supposedly mine, Emma Catherine Ross, dated April 15, 1993, written in flowing cursive that definitely was not my handwriting. The other signature was Richard Andrew Thorne, same date, in a different handwriting that was more angular and aggressive-looking. There were also 2 witness signatures from people I didn't recognize, names that meant nothing to me, but who had apparently watched this document being signed and had attested to its authenticity. Next to the signatures was a notary stamp, official and embossed, from a notary public in Philadelphia named Margaret Stevens, commission number and expiration date all properly filled in, making the whole thing look legitimate and legal and binding. I took photos of every page of the contract with my phone, making sure to capture every word and every signature and every witness mark and the notary stamp. Then I set the contract aside and looked through the other contents of the lockbox. There were other documents related to my grandmother's business, partnership agreements and financial statements and correspondence about investments. There was jewelry, some of which I recognized as pieces my grandmother had worn, some that I'd never seen before. There was cash, several $1,000s in old bills that had probably been sitting in this box for decades. There was a sealed envelope with my name on it in my grandmother's handwriting, not the Emma Catherine of the contract, but just Emma in her familiar shaky cursive. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written on my grandmother's personal stationery, dated just 2 months before she died. "My dear Emma," it started, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found the lockbox that I hoped you'd never have to find. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry for what I'm about to tell you and for what you're about to face. The contract you found is real. Richard Thorne was my business partner in the early 1990s, before you were born. We worked together on investments and we made a lot of money that paid for this house and your college fund and so many things that benefited our family. But Richard and I had a falling out over money and ownership and who deserved what share of our profits. He sued me, claimed I'd cheated him, threatened to destroy me financially and professionally. The lawsuit was nasty and expensive and scary. I was pregnant with your mother at the time. No, that's not right. Your mother was pregnant with you. I'm getting confused. Your mother was expecting you, and I was terrified that Richard's lawsuit would bankrupt us and leave nothing for you and your future. So I made a deal with Richard. He agreed to drop the lawsuit and all his claims against me. In exchange, I promised that you, my first grandchild who wasn't even born yet, would either work for him when you grow up or pay him money when you turned 30. It seemed like a good solution at the time. 30 years felt like forever away. I thought Richard would die before then or forget about it. or the contract would somehow become meaningless. I thought I'd have decades to figure out a better solution or build up enough money to pay it off or find a way to make this right. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I should have found another way. I should have fought Richard's lawsuit or declared bankruptcy or done anything other than promise away your future labor and money. But I was scared and desperate, and I made a terrible choice that seemed less terrible than the alternatives at the time. My name is Emma Catherine Ross. I'm 32 years old, work as a middle school teacher in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how I discovered that someone had legally bound me to an agreement before I existed, how that discovery led me down a path of family secrets and lies that spanned 3 decades, and how I nearly lost everything trying to untangle a web of manipulation that started long before I was born. The contract was written in dense legal language that was hard to parse, full of whereas clauses and party of the first part terminology. But even with my limited legal knowledge, I could understand the basic terms. It was an agreement for services to be rendered, compensation to be provided, obligations to be met upon reaching majority age. There were clauses about property and assets, about duties and responsibilities, about consequences for breach of contract. At the bottom, 2 signatures. One was supposedly mine, Emma Catherine Ross, dated April 15, 1993, 3 months before I was born in July of that year. The other signature was Richard Thorne, same date with an address in Philadelphia that I didn't recognize. I sat on my grandmother's old couch, the contract in my shaking hands, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. How do you sign a contract before you're born? Who was Richard Thorne? Why had my grandmother kept this locked away in her attic? What were the services and obligations mentioned in the contract? I took photos of every page with my phone, then carefully put the original back in the lockbox. My grandmother had passed away 2 months earlier, at 87, after a brief illness that had taken her quickly. We'd been close, or at least I'd thought we were close. She'd never mentioned anything about a contract or a man named Richard Thorne or any kind of agreement involving me. I called my mom from my grandmother's house, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom, I found something in Grandma's attic, a contract with my name on it. Do you know anything about a Richard Thorne?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Too long. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was tight. "Where exactly did you find this?" "In a lockbox, hidden behind a bunch of Christmas stuff. Mom, what is this? Who is Richard Thorne?" Another pause. Then, "We need to talk about this in person, not over the phone. Can you come to the house?" I drove to my parents' house in a daze, the photos of the contract pulled up on my phone at every red light, reading and rereading the terms, trying to make sense of them. My parents were waiting in the living room when I arrived, sitting close together on the couch in a way that signaled a unified front. My dad looked grim. My mom looked like she'd been crying. "Sit down, Emma," my dad said. "We need to explain some things. We should have told you years ago, but your grandmother made us promise to keep it secret unless you found out on your own." "So you know about this contract?" I asked, my voice rising. "You know about Richard Thorne? You've known this whole time and never told me?" My mom started crying again. "It's complicated, sweetheart. It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, "because what I think is that someone forged my signature on a legal document before I was born, and you all just went along with it. That's exactly what it looks like from where I'm sitting." My dad took a deep breath. "Richard Thorne was your grandmother's business partner. Back in the early 90s, before you were born, your grandmother ran a small investment firm. Richard was her partner. They worked together for about 5 years, and according to your grandmother, Richard helped her make some very profitable investments that set the family up financially. This house, your college fund, a lot of what we have came from those investments." "Okay," I said slowly, "but what does that have to do with a contract with my name on it?" "Your grandmother and Richard had a falling out," my mom said, wiping her eyes. "A major disagreement about the business. Richard claimed your grandmother had cheated him out of his share of certain profits. Your grandmother claimed Richard had breached their partnership agreement and wasn't entitled to anything more than what he'd already been paid. It got ugly. Lawyers were involved. There was a lawsuit. And in the middle of all this legal fighting, I said, they decided to drag an unborn baby into it? How does that even work? My dad looked uncomfortable. As part of the settlement of their lawsuit, Richard agreed to drop all his claims against your grandmother. In exchange, your grandmother agreed to certain terms. One of those terms was that you, when you turned 30, would provide Richard or his estate with certain services or compensation. It was your grandmother's way of ensuring the debt was paid without bankrupting herself immediately. She thought she'd have decades to prepare, to build up assets, to figure out a way to satisfy the agreement without actually burdening you. I felt my hands start to shake again. You're telling me that Grandma sold me. She sold my future labor or my money or whatever to this man to get out of a lawsuit? Before I was even born, she put my name on a contract for an agreement I never consented to. It's not like that, my mom protested. She did it to protect the family. If Richard had won the lawsuit, we would have lost everything. She made a difficult choice in a difficult situation. I'm 32 years old, I said, my voice cold. I turned 30 2 years ago. Has Richard Thorne contacted you? Has he tried to enforce this contract? My parents exchanged glances. Your grandmother told us Richard died about 10 years ago, my dad said. She said the contract died with him, that we didn't need to worry about it anymore. That's why we never told you. We thought it was over. But you don't know for sure that it's over, I said. You just assumed, based on what Grandma said. Did you ever verify that he died? Did you ever check on the legal status of this contract? No, my mom admitted. We trusted your grandmother. She said it was handled, and we believed her. I left my parents' house feeling betrayed and confused and angry. My grandmother, who I'd loved and trusted, had essentially sold me to settle a business dispute. My parents had known about it and never said a word, and somewhere out there might be someone who thought they had a legal claim on my time or money or labor because of an agreement I'd never consented to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed researching contract law, trying to understand if this document could possibly be legally binding. Most of what I found said that contracts signed by minors are voidable, meaning the minor can choose not to honor them upon reaching adulthood. But I hadn't signed this as a minor. Someone had forged my signature before I existed. That had to be fraud, right? That had to be completely unenforceable. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I found one who specialized in contract disputes and made an emergency appointment. I brought my phone with the photos of the contract and explained the whole bizarre situation. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, listened carefully, took notes, asked clarifying questions. When I finished, she spent several minutes reviewing the photos of the contract, zooming in on specific clauses, making more notes. "This is highly irregular," she said finally. "Obviously, the signature isn't yours since you weren't born yet. That's clear fraud. However, the contract itself might be construed as an agreement between Richard Thorne and your grandmother on your behalf, with you as a beneficiary who would assume certain obligations upon reaching majority age. It's unusual, but not entirely unprecedented. Parents and guardians can enter into certain types of agreements on behalf of minor children." "So it might be enforceable?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "It depends on several factors, whether Richard Thorne is actually deceased, as your parents believe, whether anyone has standing to enforce the contract on his behalf, whether the terms are actually legal and not contrary to public policy, whether consideration was properly exchanged. I'll need to do more research and see the full original document, not just photos. What are the specific services or compensation mentioned in the contract?" I pulled up the photos again and read aloud. "The party of the second part, that's me apparently, agrees upon reaching the age of 30 years to provide consulting services to the party of the first part, that's Richard Thorne, in matters of business investment for a period of 5 years, not to exceed 10 hours per week, at a rate of compensation to be determined based on prevailing market rates for similar services, or, at the option of the party of the first part, to provide a lump sum payment of $50,000 adjusted for inflation from the date of this agreement. Patricia did some quick math on her calculator. $50,000 in 1993 adjusted for inflation to now would be roughly $90,000. That's a substantial sum, and 5 years of part-time consulting, even at minimum wage, would be worth well over that amount. So someone could theoretically come after me for $90,000 because of an agreement my grandmother made before I was born? Or they could try to compel me to provide services, though that would be much harder to enforce. Courts generally don't like to force people into servitude.
The money would be the more likely claim if someone tried to enforce this. I need you to find out if Richard Thorne is really dead, I said, and if he had any heirs or estate that might try to enforce this contract. And I need to know what my legal options are for challenging this if someone does come after me. Patricia nodded. I'll start researching. In the meantime, don't sign anything, don't admit to anything, and if anyone contacts you about this contract, refer them directly to me. Don't engage with them at all. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia investigated Richard Thorne's status and the legal standing of the contract. What she found made the situation exponentially worse. Richard Thorne had indeed died 10 years ago, in 2014, but he'd had a son, Richard Thorne Jr., who was now 45 years old and apparently very much aware of the contract. In fact, Richard Jr. had been trying to contact my grandmother for the past several years, letters that she had apparently ignored or hidden. After my grandmother's death, Richard Jr. had started trying to find me. He'd hired a private investigator. He'd been making inquiries with my parents, who'd stonewalled him without telling me about it. And now that Patricia had started asking questions about him, he knew I'd found the contract. He wants to meet with you, Patricia told me over the phone. He's claiming his father's right to enforce the contract. He's demanding either the monetary payment or the consulting services. He says he has investments he needs help with, and his father's agreement with your grandmother entitles him to your assistance. Absolutely not, I said immediately. I'm not paying him anything, and I'm certainly not providing services. I never agreed to this. This whole thing is fraudulent. I agree with you, Patricia said, but he's threatening to sue if you don't comply. He's arguing that your grandmother entered into this agreement as your guardian, that consideration was paid at the time in the form of dropping the lawsuit against your grandmother, and that you're now legally obligated to fulfill the terms. We can fight this, and I think we'd likely win, but it will be expensive and time-consuming. How much would it cost to fight? Probably more than $90,000 in legal fees by the time it's all done. Litigation is expensive, especially contract disputes that might end up in appeals, and there's always some risk, however small, that a court might decide the contract is enforceable. I felt trapped. If I paid Richard Jr. $90,000, I'd be wiping out most of my savings, money I'd been carefully building up for years, money I'd been planning to use as a down payment on a house. But if I fought and lost, I could end up paying even more in legal fees, plus whatever judgment the court imposed. Before I could decide what to do, Richard Jr. forced the issue. He filed a lawsuit against me, claiming breach of contract and demanding payment of $115,000, his calculation of the inflation-adjusted amount, plus interest and penalties. I was served with papers at school, in front of my colleagues and students, which was humiliating and terrifying. Patricia filed a response on my behalf, denying all claims and arguing that the contract was fraudulent, unenforceable, and void. She argued that I'd never consented to the agreement, that the signature wasn't mine, that you can't bind someone to a contract before they exist. She argued that even if the contract could somehow be construed as valid, the terms were unconscionable and contrary to public policy. Richard Jr.'s lawyers argued back that the contract was a valid agreement between my grandmother and Richard Sr., that I was a beneficiary with obligations, that consideration had been paid, that my grandmother had signed on my behalf as my legal guardian before I was born, which was within her rights as a parent. The legal arguments got complex and esoteric, diving into obscure areas of contract law and guardianship law that I'd never even heard of. The case dragged on for months. Discovery, depositions, motions, hearings. It consumed my life. I had to take time off work to meet with lawyers and give testimony. I had to produce documents and answer invasive questions about my finances and my education and my professional qualifications. The stress was enormous. I wasn't sleeping well, I was snapping at my friends and family, I was spending money I didn't have on legal fees that kept mounting, and through it all, I kept wondering about my grandmother. Had she really thought this contract would just disappear? Had she planned to tell me eventually? Had she set aside money to deal with it that I hadn't found yet? Why had she put me in this position in the first place? My mom eventually broke down and told me more of the story. "Your grandmother was desperate when she signed that contract," she said. "Richard Thorne was threatening to destroy her financially and professionally. He was claiming she'd engaged in fraud, that she'd manipulated investments to enrich herself at his expense.
If he'd won the lawsuit, she would have lost everything and possibly faced criminal charges. The contract was a compromise. Richard agreed to drop all claims in exchange for your grandmother's promise that you would either pay him or provide services in the future. Your grandmother gambled that by the time you turned 30, Richard would be dead or would have forgotten about it, or the contract would somehow become unenforceable. She was wrong. Why didn't she just pay him what he claimed he was owed?" I asked. "If he had a legitimate claim, why negotiate this weird contract instead?" "Because she didn't have the money," my mom said. "The investments Richard wanted a share of hadn't actually paid out yet. Your grandmother had paper wealth, but not liquid cash, and she truly believed Richard's claims were inflated and unfair. She thought she was protecting the family by deferring the payment until a time when it might not be necessary at all. So she gambled with my future to protect herself," I said bitterly. "She made me responsible for her debt without ever asking if I'd be okay with that." My mom didn't have a good answer to that. She just cried and apologized and said my grandmother had loved me and had made a terrible decision under pressure. 8 months into the litigation, Patricia's investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Williams who specialized in finding old records and documents for legal cases, found something in the Philadelphia court archives that changed everything about our case. He'd been going through boxes of files from the original 1992-1993 lawsuit between my grandmother, Elizabeth Ross, and Richard Andrew Thorne Sr., files that had been relegated to storage in the courthouse basement after the case was settled and that no one had looked at in over 30 years. These weren't the main case files that we'd already obtained through normal legal channels. These were supplementary boxes, exhibits and discovery materials and correspondence that had been filed with the court but that hadn't made it into the primary case record. Marcus spent 3 full days in that courthouse basement, which he later told me was hot and dusty and filled with boxes stacked floor to ceiling containing decades of legal history, going through everything related to the Ross v. Thorne lawsuit. What he found was a set of internal memos and financial documents from Richard Sr.'s business records, documents that had been obtained through discovery during the original lawsuit, but that apparently had never been fully examined or understood at the time. These documents showed that Richard Thorne Sr. had been systematically manipulating financial records to inflate his claims against my grandmother. He'd created fake invoices for services he'd never provided. He'd backdated documents to make it look like he'd made investments that he actually hadn't made until much later. He'd altered partnership agreements to change profit-sharing percentages in his favor. The evidence was clear and damning. Richard Sr. had been committing fraud, not just against my grandmother, but potentially against other business partners and clients as well. The documents showed a pattern of deception going back years, a deliberate scheme to extract money from people by making them think they owed him more than they actually did. One particularly damaging memo, written by Richard Sr. himself to his accountant, laid out the strategy explicitly.
I'm going to push Elizabeth Ross into a settlement. She doesn't have the resources for a prolonged legal battle, and she's scared about what this lawsuit might do to her family's finances. If I can make my claims look legitimate enough, even though I know I'm overstating what I'm owed, she'll settle just to make this go away. Once she settles, I'll have extracted a significant sum without having to prove anything in court. The memo was dated 2 weeks before the contract with my name on it was signed. It showed premeditation and intent to defraud. It showed that Richard Thorne Sr. had known his claims against my grandmother were exaggerated or fabricated, and that he deliberately used the threat of litigation to extract a settlement that included the bizarre contract binding an unborn child to future obligations. Patricia immediately filed an amended complaint and new motions, arguing that the contract was the product of fraud and duress, that it was void from the beginning because Richard Thorne Sr. had procured it through illegal means and deliberate deception. She argued that Richard Jr. couldn't enforce a contract that his father had obtained fraudulently, regardless of whether Richard Jr. himself had been aware of the fraud. She attached copies of the memos and financial documents as exhibits, highlighting the particularly damaging statements where Richard Sr. admitted to planning the fraudulent scheme. The impact on our case was immediate and dramatic. Richard Jr.'s lawyers, who up until this point had been aggressive and confident in their legal positions, suddenly became defensive and conciliatory.
They filed motions trying to exclude the evidence, arguing that it was too old, that it wasn't relevant to the enforceability of the contract, that fraud in the underlying business relationship was separate from the validity of the settlement agreement. But the judge wasn't buying it. In a hearing that I attended with Patricia, sitting in the courtroom with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, the judge reviewed the newly discovered evidence and made a preliminary ruling that sent waves of relief through my entire body. The court finds, the judge said, reading from notes he'd prepared, that there is substantial evidence that the contract at issue was procured through fraud and misrepresentation by Richard Thorne Sr. The evidence suggests that Mr. Thorne deliberately exaggerated or fabricated claims against the defendant's grandmother in order to force a settlement that included terms binding an unborn child to future financial obligations. This court is deeply troubled by the circumstances under which this agreement was reached and by the attempt to enforce it against someone who had no knowledge of or participation in the original negotiations. While I'm not making a final ruling at this stage, I am finding that the defendant has raised significant questions about the validity and enforceability of this contract. The judge ordered mediation before the case could proceed to trial, strongly suggesting that both parties should seriously consider settling rather than continuing to litigate given the weakness of the plaintiff's position in light of the fraud evidence. The mediation took place 3 weeks later in a bland conference room in a downtown Philadelphia office building that specialized in hosting legal mediations and arbitrations. Richard Jr. and his 2 lawyers occupied one conference room, Patricia Adai occupied another. The mediator, a retired judge named Howard Chen, who'd spent 40 years on the bench and now made his living helping people settle their disputes, shuttled back and forth between the rooms trying to find common ground and broker a resolution. The first few hours were tense and unproductive. Richard Jr. was still insisting through the mediator that he was entitled to the full amount he was claiming, over $100,000 plus his legal fees. He argued through his lawyers that even if his father had behaved badly in the original business relationship, the contract had been signed and notarized and should be honored, that my grandmother had entered into it voluntarily, that I'd benefited from the assets that were protected by the settlement and therefore should pay the price that had been agreed to. I refused to pay anything close to that amount. I argued that I'd never consented to this agreement, that I'd been victimized first by Richard Sr.'s fraud against my grandmother, and then by Richard Jr.'s decision to try to enforce a contract he should have known was problematic. I told the mediator that I was willing to walk away and take my chances at trial rather than pay a 6-figure sum for something I had no part in creating.
The mediator kept pushing both sides to be realistic about the risks of trial. He told Richard Jr. that the fraud evidence was very damaging, that a jury might be sympathetic to a young woman being sued over a contract signed before she was born, that there was a real risk he'd lose at trial and walk away with nothing. He told me that litigation was expensive and unpredictable, that even with the fraud evidence, we couldn't be certain how a judge would rule, that there was some risk, however small, that a court might decide the contract was enforceable despite its origins. After 4 hours of this back and forth, with both sides having lunch brought in because the mediation was taking so long, the mediator made a proposal. Richard Jr. would drop his lawsuit entirely and waive all claims under the contract forever. In exchange, I would pay him $20,000 as what the mediator called a nuisance settlement, acknowledging that we all wanted this matter resolved without the cost and uncertainty of trial. The payment would not be an admission that the contract was valid or that I owed anything under it. It would simply be the price to make the litigation go away and move on with my life. $20,000. The number made me feel physically sick. That was more than a year of my careful savings. That was money I'd been planning to use as a down payment on a house. That was hundreds of hours of work, of getting up early to teach middle schoolers about fractions and geometry, of grading papers late into the night, of coaching after-school math club. That was real money, money I'd earned through hard work, money that should have been building my future. But it was also less than half what I'd already spent on legal fees. Patricia estimated that if we went to trial, I'd spend another $30,000 to $50,000 in legal costs, maybe more if the case went to appeals, and there was always some risk, however small, that we'd lose.
That a judge might rule against us, that I'd end up owing the full amount Richard Jr. was claiming plus his legal costs. The calculation was brutal and pragmatic. I could pay $20,000 now and be done with this nightmare, or I could gamble that we'd win at trial, spending more money and more time and more emotional energy on a case that had already consumed a year of my life. I talked it over with Patricia for an hour in our conference room, going through all the possibilities and risks and potential outcomes. She was careful not to tell me what to do, explaining that this was ultimately my decision and that she'd support whatever I chose. But she also laid out the realities clearly. We had a strong case. The fraud evidence was compelling. She thought we'd probably win at trial, but probably isn't the same as certainly, and litigation is expensive and stressful and unpredictable. If I could live with paying $20,000 now and be done with this nightmare, she thought that was a reasonable choice. If I couldn't stomach paying anything to someone trying to enforce a fraudulent contract, she'd fight this case all the way to the end. I thought about my grandmother, who'd made the original terrible decision to sign that contract. I thought about Richard Thorne Sr., who deliberately defrauded my grandmother and created this whole mess. I thought about Richard Jr., sitting in the other conference room, trying to extract money from me based on his father's fraud. I thought about how angry and violated I felt, how much I wanted to fight on principle, how wrong it seemed to pay anything at all. But I also thought about how exhausted I was, how the lawsuit had taken over my life for 8 months, how I'd been barely sleeping, barely eating, barely functioning as a normal human being, how I wanted my life back, how I wanted to stop spending every spare moment dealing with lawyers and court dates and legal documents, how I wanted to be able to think about my future again instead of being trapped in this nightmare from my family's past. Patricia's investigator found documents that changed everything. Hidden in old court records from the original lawsuit between my grandmother and Richard Thorne Sr. was evidence that Richard had indeed defrauded my grandmother, that his claims against her had been fabricated, that he'd manipulated records to make it look like he was owed more than he actually was. The documents showed that Richard had signed the settlement agreement and the contract with my name on it while knowing his claims were fraudulent. He'd essentially blackmailed my grandmother into an agreement by threatening to pursue bogus legal claims that would have been expensive and damaging to defend against, even though they were false. This changed the nature of the case dramatically.
Patricia filed new motions arguing that the contract was the product of fraud and duress, that it was void from the beginning because Richard Thorne Sr. had procured it through illegal means. She argued that Richard Jr. couldn't enforce a contract that his father had obtained fraudulently, regardless of whether Richard Jr. himself knew about the fraud. Richard Jr.'s lawyers tried to argue that the fraud in the original business relationship was separate from the validity of the contract, that the contract itself was a settlement agreement that should be honored regardless of the underlying disputes. But the judge didn't buy it. In a hearing that I attended with my heart pounding the entire time, the judge reviewed the evidence and made a preliminary ruling that the contract appeared to be the product of fraud, and that I had strong grounds to challenge its enforceability. The judge ordered mediation before the case could proceed to trial. The mediation was tense and unpleasant. Richard Jr. and I sat in different conference rooms in the mediator's office, with the mediator shuttling back and forth between us, trying to find common ground. Richard Jr. initially insisted he was entitled to the full amount he was claiming, over $100,000. He argued that even if his father had behaved badly in the original business relationship, the contract had been signed and should be honored. I refused to pay anything. I argued that I'd never consented to this agreement, that I'd been victimized by both his father's fraud and my grandmother's poor judgment, and that I shouldn't have to pay for crimes and mistakes that happened before I was born. After hours of back and forth, the mediator proposed a compromise. Richard Jr. would drop his lawsuit and waive all claims under the contract. In exchange, I would pay him $20,000 as a nuisance settlement, not as an admission that the contract was valid, but simply to make the litigation go away. $20,000 was still a huge amount of money for me, more than a year of savings, but it was less than I'd already spent on legal fees and far less than I'd spend if the case went to trial. I was angry about having to pay anything at all to someone trying to enforce a fraudulent contract against me. But I was also exhausted and stressed and desperate for this nightmare to be over. I wanted my life back. I wanted to stop spending every spare moment dealing with lawyers and court dates. I wanted to sleep through the night again without waking up anxious about this case. So I agreed. I paid Richard Jr. $20,000 that I'd earned through years of hard work as a teacher, money that should have gone toward my future, to settle a debt I never owed based on a contract I never signed. The lawsuit was dismissed. The contract was officially declared null and void as part of the settlement agreement. I would never hear from Richard Thorne Jr. again. But the damage had been done. I'd lost a year of my life to this litigation. I'd lost over $40,000 when you combined the settlement payment and my legal fees. I'd lost faith in my grandmother, who I'd always seen as a loving and wise matriarch, but who I now understood had been capable of selfish and short-sighted decisions that harmed people she claimed to love. I'd lost my sense of security, the belief that my life was my own and that I had control over my future. The therapy I started after the settlement was finalized, which took place in a small office with comfortable chairs and soft lighting and a box of tissues that I went through at an alarming rate during those early sessions, has been one of the most important investments I've made in my recovery from this experience. Dr. Sarah Kim, who specializes in trauma and family issues and what she calls financial abuse, has helped me process the incredibly complex emotions around what happened with the contract in the lawsuit and my family's role in all of it. The anger at my grandmother has been one of the hardest things to work through. On one hand, I loved her. She was my grandmother, the woman who baked me cookies and took me to the park and came to all my school plays and told me stories about the family history and made me feel special and loved throughout my entire childhood. On the other hand, she made a decision that fundamentally violated my autonomy and my rights, that treated me as a bargaining chip rather than as a person, that prioritized her own financial security over my future well-being. Dr. Kim helped me understand that both of these things can be true at the same time. My grandmother loved me and also made a terrible, selfish decision. She was a good grandmother in many ways, and also someone who was willing to sacrifice my interests for her own when she felt desperate and cornered. People are complicated and capable of both love and harm, often directed at the same person. She also helped me understand that my grandmother's decision wasn't really about me at all. When she signed that contract, I was just an abstract future possibility, not a real person yet. She couldn't have fully comprehended what she was doing to me because I didn't exist to do it to. That doesn't excuse the decision or make it okay, but it does help me understand how someone who loved me could have done something so harmful. The anger at my parents has been easier to process in some ways because they're still alive and we can talk about it and work through it together in family therapy sessions. They made the wrong choice in keeping the contract secret, but they made that choice out of misplaced trust in my grandmother and a desire to avoid family conflict, not out of any intent to harm me. They've apologized sincerely and repeatedly. They've acknowledged that they should have told me the truth regardless of what my grandmother wanted. They've expressed genuine remorse for the position their silence put me in. That doesn't undo the harm or give me back the money I lost, but it does provide a foundation for rebuilding trust. The anger at Richard Thorne Sr. is clearer and more straightforward because he was unambiguously a bad actor. He committed fraud. He deliberately manipulated the system to extract money from my grandmother through threats and deception. He created a contract binding an unborn child to future obligations as part of his fraudulent scheme.
There's no complexity or nuance there, just clear wrongdoing. But he's dead, so that anger has nowhere to go except into accepting that bad people exist in the world, and sometimes their actions have consequences that ripple forward through time in ways they probably never anticipated or cared about. The anger at Richard Thorne Jr. is more complicated. He didn't create the contract or commit the original fraud, but he chose to enforce it, knowing that it was binding someone to terms they've never agreed to. He could have looked at the situation and decided it was morally wrong to pursue a claim against someone based on a contract signed before they were born. Instead, he chose to see it purely as a business matter, as an asset he'd inherited that had value and that he was entitled to extract. That choice reveals something about his character and values that I find troubling and upsetting. The grief has been as significant as the anger. Grief for the relationship I thought I had with my grandmother, for the image of her as someone who would always protect me and put my interests first. Grief for my family's innocence, for the belief that we were a normal family without dark secrets or complicated histories. Grief for my own naivete, for the trust I had that my life was entirely my own and that no one could claim obligations from me that I hadn't consented to. Dr. Kim explained that grief after betrayal is normal and necessary. When someone we love and trust does something that fundamentally violates that relationship, we have to grieve the loss of the relationship we thought we had. We have to mourn the person we thought they were, even if they're still alive, or if our relationship with them continues in an altered form. That grief is real and valid and deserves space and time to be processed. The financial impact has been substantial and will affect my life for years to come. Between the $20,000 settlement payment and the legal fees I paid to Patricia throughout the litigation, I spent over $40,000 total resolving this contract dispute. That's money I'd been saving for years, money that represented my financial security and my plans for the future. My down payment fund for a house is depleted. My emergency savings is gone. I'm basically starting over financially in my 30s, which feels frustrating and demoralizing when I'd worked so hard to be in a good financial position. But I'm rebuilding, slowly and deliberately. I've gone back to the savings habits that worked for me before. I'm putting a percentage of each paycheck into a high-yield savings account. I'm living below my means and avoiding unnecessary expenses. I'm taking on occasional tutoring work for extra income. It will take years to get back to where I was financially before this lawsuit, but I will get there. And at least now I'm building my future with the knowledge that there are no hidden contracts or obligations waiting to derail my plans. The impact on my relationship with my parents has been significant, but not irreparable. We went through several months of family therapy together, working through the hurt and betrayal and mistrust that had developed during the lawsuit. They've been genuinely remorseful and have worked hard to rebuild my trust.
They've also been supportive in practical ways, offering to help me financially, even though I didn't accept their offers because I needed to maintain my independence, and they weren't responsible for my grandmother's decisions or the settlement I chose to make. Our relationship now is different than it was before. There's less innocence, more awareness of the ways that family members can hurt each other, even when they love each other. But there's also more honesty, more direct communication, less sweeping things under the rug and hoping they'll never become problems. In some ways, our relationship is healthier now than it was before, built on a more realistic foundation that acknowledges human fallibility and the importance of making hard choices, even when they create family conflict. I've also had to reckon with difficult questions about inheritance and family money and what I'm morally entitled to. The house I grew up in, my college education, various financial advantages I had growing up, they were all funded at least in part by the investments my grandmother made in partnership with Richard Thorne Sr., investments that were apparently the subject of legitimate disputes about who deserved what share of the profits. The settlement my grandmother reached, which included the contract with my name on it, allowed her to keep more of those assets than she might have been entitled to if Richard Sr.'s claims had been litigated fully and fairly. So, in some sense, I benefited from the same contract that later came back to harm me. I profited from an agreement that was the product of fraud and duress, even though I had no knowledge of or control over any of it. Dr. Kim has helped me think through these moral questions without getting trapped in unhelpful guilt spirals. She points out that I was a child when these investments benefited my family, that I had no say in how my grandmother conducted her business or managed her finances, that children aren't responsible for their parents' or grandparents' financial decisions. She acknowledges that the situation is morally complex, but emphasizes that I'm not ethically obligated to impoverish myself to atone for decisions other people made decades ago. At the same time, she's encouraged me to think about ways I might want to address the discomfort I feel about benefiting from ethically questionable situations. Not through grand gestures or bankrupting myself, but through small actions that align with my values. I've started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helps people navigate contract disputes and consumer fraud cases. I've been more intentional about charitable giving, particularly to organizations that help people dealing with debt and financial exploitation. These actions don't erase the ethical complexity of my situation, but they help me feel like I'm using my experience and resources in positive ways. Now, almost 2 years after finding that contract in my grandmother's attic, I'm slowly rebuilding my life with a different understanding of family and trust and legal obligations. I'm more cautious about sharing information about my finances and my legal affairs. I check my credit report regularly, paranoid about what other surprises might be lurking in my financial history. I keep copies of important documents in multiple secure locations. I read contracts carefully before signing anything, even when it's just a standard rental agreement or a new credit card application. I've become the kind of person who asks questions and seeks clarification, and doesn't just trust that everything is what it appears to be on the surface. Some of this increased vigilance is probably healthy, a form of self-protection that will serve me well throughout my life. Some of it is probably excessive, a trauma response that makes me see threats where there might not be any. Dr. Kim and I work on finding the balance, on being appropriately cautious without becoming paranoid or unable to trust anyone or anything. The experience has also made me think differently about the stories we tell about our families and the secrets we keep. Every family has complicated histories, decisions that were made under pressure or out of desperation, actions that seemed reasonable at the time but look questionable in hindsight. But hiding those histories, keeping them secret in the hope they'll never surface, creates conditions for those old decisions to cause new harm when they're eventually discovered. If my grandmother had told me about this contract when I turned 18 or 21 or 25, we could have dealt with it together. We could have consulted lawyers while she was still alive to provide context and information. We could have potentially negotiated with Richard Sr. or Richard Jr. from a position of more knowledge and preparation. Instead, the secret festered until after my grandmother's death, leaving me to deal with the consequences alone, without her guidance or support. I've decided that if I ever have children, I will be radically honest with them about family financial matters and legal obligations, not in ways that burden them with adult responsibilities while they're still young, but in ways that prepare them to understand their situation and make informed decisions. No secret contracts, no hidden obligations, no surprises waiting in attic lockboxes to upend their lives when they're adults. The impact on my sense of identity and autonomy has been profound. Before finding this contract, I believed my life was entirely my own, that I had complete control over my choices and my future. Finding out that someone had legally bound me to obligations before I existed shattered that illusion. It made me realize how much of our lives is shaped by decisions other people make, by historical circumstances we inherit, by systems and structures that exist whether we consent to them or not. That realization has been both disturbing and liberating. Disturbing because it undermines the comforting fiction that we're all independent individuals charting our own courses.
Liberating because it removes some of the pressure to be entirely self-made and self-determined. We're all shaped by our histories and our families and our circumstances. Acknowledging that doesn't mean we're powerless, but it does mean we're part of larger stories that started before us and will continue after us. Anger at my grandmother for creating this situation, anger at Richard Thorne Sr. for being a fraudulent blackmailer, anger at Richard Jr. for pursuing a claim he must have known was legally and morally questionable, anger at my parents for not warning me sooner, anger at a legal system that let this get as far as it did before stopping it. But also grief for the loss of the relationship I thought I had with my grandmother, confusion about family loyalty and obligation, fear about what other secrets might be hiding in my family history, anxiety about my financial future after losing so much money to this mess. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, has helped me understand that what happened to me was a form of financial abuse, even though the abuser was dead before the abuse fully manifested. My grandmother had used my identity and my future to solve her own problems without my consent. She'd valued her immediate financial security over my long-term well-being. She'd treated me as an asset to be leveraged rather than as a person with autonomy and rights. Dr. Kim also helped me recognize the ways this experience has affected my ability to trust. I find myself questioning everything now, wondering what other agreements or obligations might be lurking in my family's history. I'm hyper-vigilant about my legal and financial affairs, constantly checking my credit report and my legal records, paranoid that some other surprise might be waiting for me. The impact on my relationship with my parents has been significant too. I love them, and I know they love me, but I feel betrayed by their decision to keep the contract secret even after I turned 30. They prioritized my grandmother's wishes over my right to know about agreements made in my name. They let me live in ignorance while this potential liability hung over my head. We're working on rebuilding trust through family therapy sessions, where we talk through what happened and why they made the choices they made. They've apologized repeatedly and genuinely seem to understand that they should have told me the truth years ago. But apologies don't undo the harm or give me back the money I lost or restore the year of my life that was consumed by litigation. I've also had to reckon with questions about inheritance and family money. The house I grew up in, my college education, various family assets, they were all funded at least in part by the investments my grandmother made with Richard Thorne Sr., investments that were apparently the subject of legitimate disputes about who deserved what share of the profits. Do I have any moral obligation to Richard Jr. beyond the settlement we reached? Did I benefit from my grandmother's possibly unethical business practices? Should I feel guilty about the family wealth that may have been built on questionable foundations? These are questions without easy answers.
Dr. Kim encourages me to focus on the fact that I was a child and then an adult living my life with no knowledge of any of this, that I'm not responsible for my grandmother's business decisions or my parents' choices about what to tell me. But the questions still linger. Now, almost 2 years after finding that contract in my grandmother's attic, I'm slowly rebuilding my life and my finances. I'm putting money back into savings, though it will take years to get back to where I was before the settlement. I'm working on trusting my family again, though the relationships have changed in ways that can't be fully repaired. I'm learning to live with uncertainty and the knowledge that life can throw completely unexpected complications at you based on decisions made by other people before you were born. What I've learned from this experience is that family secrets have a way of coming out eventually, and the longer they're hidden, the more damage they do when revealed. If my grandmother had told me about this contract when I turned 18 or 21 or 25, we could have dealt with it together. We could have consulted lawyers early, gathered evidence, prepared a defense. Instead, she hid it and hoped it would never become a problem. And when it did become a problem after her death, I had to face it alone, without her guidance or support. I've learned that you can be legally bound by agreements you never made, at least to some extent. The law around contracts signed on behalf of others is complex and sometimes seems unjust. Parents and guardians have broad authority to make decisions for children, including financial decisions that have long-term consequences. While there are limits to that authority, the limits aren't always clear or protective enough. I've learned that litigation is expensive and stressful and all-consuming, even when you're in the right. Fighting a lawsuit costs money and time and emotional energy that most people don't have to spare. Sometimes settling an unjust claim makes more financial sense than fighting it on principle, which feels wrong but is often the practical reality. I've learned to read contracts carefully and keep detailed records of my legal and financial affairs. I check my credit report regularly. I keep copies of important documents in multiple locations. I make sure I understand what I'm signing before I sign it. I ask questions and consult professionals when something seems unclear or questionable. Most importantly, I've learned that your family history can impact your present in ways you never anticipated. We like to think we are independent individuals charting our own courses, but we're all connected to the people who came before us through genetics and finances and legal relationships, and sometimes through contracts signed in our names before we existed. Understanding your family's full history, including the parts that are uncomfortable or complicated, is important for understanding your own position in the world. If you're going through something similar, if you've discovered unexpected agreements or obligations tied to your name, here's what I'd advise. First, don't panic. Get copies of all relevant documents and consult with a lawyer who specializes in contract law. Many lawyers will do a free initial consultation where they can assess whether you have a serious problem or not. Second, gather information about the history of the agreement. Who signed it? When? Under what circumstances? Is there evidence of fraud or duress? Are the terms actually legal and enforceable? The more you understand about the context and the legal standing of the agreement, the better positioned you'll be to challenge it if necessary. Third, don't assume that just because something is written in a contract that it's valid and enforceable. Contracts can be challenged on many grounds, including fraud, duress, impossibility, unconscionableness, lack of consideration, lack of capacity, and violation of public policy. A good lawyer can evaluate whether any of these defenses might apply to your situation. Fourth, consider the costs and benefits of fighting versus settling. Fighting on principle might feel righteous, but if it's going to cost you more than settling would, you need to think carefully about whether the fight is worth it. Only you can make that calculation based on your specific circumstances and values. Fifth, deal with your emotional reactions. Finding out you're bound by agreements you never consented to is violating and enraging and scary. Those feelings are valid, but they can also cloud your judgment and make it harder to think strategically about how to handle the situation. Therapy or counseling can help you process the emotions while you deal with the legal and practical aspects. Finally, learn from the experience and take steps to protect yourself going forward. Make sure you understand all your legal and financial obligations. Keep good records. Check your credit report regularly. Make sure your family members aren't making decisions in your name without your knowledge. Set boundaries about what authority others have over your affairs.
2 years out, I still sometimes get angry when I think about that contract with my forged signature hidden in my grandmother's attic. I still sometimes feel betrayed by her decision to use my name and my future to solve her problems. I still sometimes worry about what other surprises might be lurking in my family's past. But I'm also proud of how I handled it. I fought back. I didn't just accept that I was bound by this agreement. I hired a lawyer, I challenged it, I pushed back against someone trying to enforce an unjust claim against me. Yes, I ultimately settled for pragmatic reasons, but I settled on my own terms after making an informed decision about what was best for me. And I've used this experience to become more aware and more prepared and more careful about my legal and financial affairs. I'm not just drifting through life assuming everything will work itself out. I'm actively managing my affairs and making sure I understand my obligations and my rights. That sense of control and awareness is something positive that came out of a deeply negative experience. The contract I found in my grandmother's attic was signed by a man I never met, binding me to obligations I never agreed to, involving me in disputes that started before I was born. But I'm no longer bound by it. I challenged it, I fought it, I settled it, and I moved on. My life is my own now, in ways it might not have been if I'd simply accepted that contract as valid and paid what was demanded. If my story helps someone else who finds themselves in a similar situation, if it helps someone recognize that they can fight back against unjust agreements, even when those agreements seem official and legal and binding, then sharing all of this will have been worth it. You're not automatically bound by every contract that has your name on it. You have rights, you have options, you can challenge things that seem unjust, and sometimes, with the right help and the right evidence and enough determination, you can win. If you found this story meaningful, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered unexpected legal or financial obligations tied to your name? How did you handle it? What advice would you give to others in similar situations? Your experience might help someone else who's struggling with something similar. If this story helped you think differently about contracts and family obligations and legal rights, please consider supporting the channel so I can continue sharing these stories. Thank you for listening. You can find more stories about legal issues and family complications on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.